The First World War, a conflict that devoured men like no other. A new horror of automated fighting and killing. For the first time in history, death came en masse. When the guns finally fell silent, the world would never look the same again. World War I, the conflict that pitted 20th century war machines against 19th century tactics. The images of young men blindly walking into hails of machine gun fire summed up the barbarity of modern trench warfare. At its height, millions threw their bodies against the might of cannon fire and bullet, all in the pursuit of a few yards gained. Over 4 cataclysmic years, the world's great powers, assembled in 2 opposing forces, waged war across the planet. 70 million military personnel were mobilized. New technology fueled the lethality of weapons, and without equivalent improvements in defense or tactics, the generals resorted to mass human wave attacks. By the war's end, almost 10 million military personnel had been killed. Whole nations mourned the dead, the missing, and disabled. Returning soldiers brought home with them severe mental trauma. Each nation involved has been scarred deeply, leaving a lasting impact on social memory. Such collective trauma destroyed optimism and created a term for those that had fought in the war: the lost generation. These are the bare facts, remembered so they can't be forgotten. But within all this and amid such tumultuous times, the human element can get lost. Recently restored German archive, much of it never before seen, catapults us back and lifts the veil on the people and times where death was reduced to a mere blowing of a whistle. Some wars name themselves. This is the Great War. The war had now been raging for 2 years. Several million soldiers were fighting on the battlefields of Europe. By 1916, the German advance into France had long ground to a halt. The Western Front had turned into bitter, static trench warfare. French and German soldiers faced each other along a 700-kilometer front line, which included Verdun. The war swallowed up huge resources, both soldiers and materials. The Germans wanted to regain the advantage and planned an offensive at the Meuse River. The French were only too aware of what was at stake and took up their positions. But this war was like none other before. Now, death came from above.
The war in the air in 1916 takes a dramatically different turn. A turn that begins at Verdun right at the start of the year, because that is the moment when the German Air Force takes the decision to concentrate fighters into squadrons. And by doing that, to create areas of airspace which they are in control of for that period of time while the aircraft are in the air, which is part of the reason why the Germans can prepare the Verdun offensive in so much secrecy.
The aviators were tasked with a crucial assignment: to recce the military situation at Verdun from the air. Hundreds of pictures were taken. They deliver key intelligence on the enemy's size and positions. A chateau near Epernay, a safe distance from the front. Armed with photographs, the pilots are ushered into the highest military circles. The Kaiser's son, Crown Prince Wilhelm, commanded the local attacking forces. Chief of Staff von Falkenhayn bore the overall responsibility. Armed with this new intelligence, the German High Command now believed they pinpointed their opponent's weak spot. The Battle of Verdun had been raging since the 21st of February 1916. Thousands of German artillery pieces pounded the fortifications outside the town, clearing the way for the advancing infantry. Never before had such concentrations of artillery been unleashed in such a small area. The destruction was unprecedented.
This feeling of wanting to break through and force a decision remained a basic aspiration right until the end and continued to refresh fighting courage.
This war was unlike any other. Sheer numbers were the preferred military tactic. Both armies possessed a small proportion of professional soldiers fighting next to millions of young men from all walks of life, all lacking serious military experience. Technological progress now showed its cruel face. The area between the opposing trenches became known as the death zone. Symbolic of the Battle of Verdun would be its fortresses. Fort Douaumont was the biggest. After just a few days, the Germans managed to conquer it without difficulty. Not only was it the most strategic of all the fortresses, it was also the most modern in the defensive buffer zone protecting Verdun. The defeat was a massive shock to the French. Despite the static nature of the Western Front, in Verdun alone, thousands of French and German soldiers were taken prisoner as futile attempts to break through failed. Nobody was prepared for the tidal wave of POWs.
In the First World War, prisoners of war en masse are a first. Suddenly, there are 100,000 captives. What could be done with all these people? There is no precedent. So they have to compromise. I have to say, despite all the cruelties that did take place, there is a substantial difference between the treatment of prisoners of war in World War I and World War II.
All in all, 8 million men were held in prisoner-of-war camps. The Hague Conventions ensured that survival rates were generally higher than those suffered at the front. The number of wounded and maimed reached hundreds of thousands. Modern technology attempted to repair the damage it had inflicted on the battlefield. Propaganda footage was released to reassure people that victims were well cared for.
It is true that this side of the war was made public. It wasn't hidden away. At times, the advertisement of prosthetics in German specialist journals and in the public newspapers goes so far that to be sarcastic, one might be feeling a little jealous of the people who don't have a silly arm anymore, but instead a fabulous gripping tool, who can screw a hammer or pliers straight onto the prosthetic rather than having to cope with a cumbersome hand.
The films portray the maimed and crippled as still productive by contributing to the war effort.
They're doing well. Don't worry. That's how people manage to cope with this appalling experience.
Initially, these pictures were kept from the public.
The French call this the gueule cassée, and the association of, in English, broken faces, is still very powerful in France, even today.
Broken faces, broken lives. The war had already destroyed so much in so little time. Ahead lay the horror of the battle for Verdun. Verdun, just 18 kilometers from Paris. German artillery reached as far as the town square. This city would be pivotal in how the Western Front was contested. Thousands fled, scenes that would become commonplace during the Second World War. The French feared the Germans could make a breakthrough and reach Paris within just a few weeks. It was imperative that positions were held at all costs. If Verdun fell, it was feared, so would France. Henri-Philippe Pétain, an experienced general, took overall control. For the flag, for victory. A French propaganda poster. Virtually every French soldier would fight at Verdun at some point during the war. Parisians had lived with the imminent threat of Germans overrunning their capital for 2 years. On the face of it, apparent normality continued. Women set the tone. With millions of men away fighting at the front, the needs of their families at home were well catered for. The people of France didn't starve, but that's only part of the story.
For civilians far removed from the front, daily routines become homogeneous. They continue with their normal activities, but that's deceptive. Even if you're in Marseille, you still have a father, a brother, or a son serving at the front. If you work in the fields, you're in a way feeding the war. If you're working in a factory, you're more than likely also working for the war. This apparent normality can be very misleading. The war is not physically here, but it's unlikely anybody can escape the war in these times.
In Germany, queuing for essentials: bread, butter, meat, and vegetables. Many provisions went straight to the military. Even clothes were rationed. Early confidence in a quick, decisive German victory had evaporated.
This war is the new life. This is how our lives are going to be. We're all much more comfortable if we just accept that we're now a country at war and we have no prospect of it ever ending. And that way, we'll stop worrying. We'll stop having to calculate. We'll become resigned to our fates. We'll become institutionalized, really, as war-making nations. And I think the longer that goes on, the more that mood takes place and hope becomes extinguished.
Key to Germany's lack of resources was the British naval blockade. As early as 1914, the North Sea was declared a war zone. Only once did the German Navy attempt to challenge the British fleet, May the 31st, 1916. The two powers contested one of the largest naval battles in history at Skagerrak off Norway, the Battle of Jutland. The British far outnumbered the Germans, 150 ships against 100. In the end, neither side were victorious, but there were many casualties, over 6,000 British dead, with more than 2,500 on the German side. The Germans sank twice as many ships, but the blockade remained intact. In the face of British superiority, any further attempts to break through seemed pointless. For the German sailors, it was a time of inactivity. At the end of the war, they refused a combat mission ordered by the Kaiser and rebelled. The war was also proving to be a logistical nightmare behind the front line. Supplies of personnel, weapons, and ammunition were deciding factors over winners and losers.
The logistical effort required to put this offensive in place is enormous, because what you're effectively having to do is to create roads where there are no roads, railways where there are no railways, and put in a system of telegraph communication which isn't in place necessarily either.
The front wasn't just a system of trenches and fortifications. The facilities needed to cater for the troops reached far behind the front line. There were field kitchens, bakeries, stables, and transport fleets, ammunition depots, and weapon arsenals. First aid stations were about 3 kilometers from the front. field hospitals, about 20. Trains led almost to the front line, because every day they had to deliver enough provisions to look after an army equivalent to the population of a major city. Every battalion was a mirror image of society and all its professions. On the French side, everyday life behind the front line was also being documented. Alcohol is distributed to quell the soldiers' fear of the next assault. The war ate up more resources than any before it and required supplies on a sheer unimaginable scale. An enormous industrial undertaking involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers who must eat, sleep, and fight here.
The Battle of Verdun was so special because it was fought on a very small area. It was not the costliest battle of the First World War, but it was the battle fought on the smallest area. And in this very small, tiny area around Verdun, hundreds of thousands of soldiers fought, hundreds of thousands of soldiers died, and this small area around Verdun saw the first battle of attrition of the First World War.
Massive reserves of munitions were stockpiled, ready to plough up just a few square kilometers of ground, and turned the battlefield into a living hell. The French company commander Jacques Delvert commented in his diary, "Modern warfare is no longer a man-to-man fight. The enemy is everywhere. Its deadly ammunition rains from the sky. Modern weapons turn once honorable combat into a senseless slaughter. This battle has already been raging for 100 days. The trench warfare is wearing my men down. We should end this war as soon as possible." A young Frenchman wrote in his letter from the front, "15 days in Verdun have drained and demoralized us, more than 6 months in the trenches before." Millions of letters from the front reach families at home, but increasingly they bring news of deaths, of battle wounds and maimings, of farewells and lost hope. There was no safe place on the battlefield. Death now came from the air. Reconnaissance aircraft became fighter planes, which then developed into bombers. Cameras were exchanged for machine guns and explosives. But contrary to the battles on the ground, this was still an apparently gallant war.
They're looking for duels, in a way almost like a step back to the Middle Ages, where you would also try to compete with each other during a personal dispute. That's the difference to the soldiers in the trenches.
But despite the romantic notions, these skirmishes were harbingers of a war that only decades later would obliterate entire cities. The War of the Bombers. For now, these were isolated attacks involving just a few hundred aircraft. But new aviation technology still delivered terror from the skies. Airships pushed far into enemy airspace from Paris to London. These attacks, with little strategic benefit, were designed to spread fear amongst the population. But the First World War was fought mainly on the ground, and the Battle for Verdun was reaching a crucial stage. Early summer 1916. The Battle for Verdun had reached a decisive point. and a grueling jostling for position around Fort Vaux ensued. June the 1st, 1916, a full-on assault of Fort Vaux commenced. A German senior lieutenant of the 50th Infantry Division noted, "The great day has arrived. We're going to attack Fort Vaux. Just before the attack, all doubts disappear, and our duty to our holy fatherland wins out."
If you compare less than 30 years later, what happens at Stalingrad, for example, that battle is the same genus, if you like. The big difference is it's taking place in a city, which I think is one of the big contrasts between the First and the Second World Wars, is that cities become battlegrounds because people realize the defensive capabilities of a city, even in a semi-destroyed or totally destroyed state. But the weapon systems that are being used in the Second World War are weapon systems that, broadly speaking, reached their maturity in the First World War and are being fought by armies of comparable size and scale.
The First World War is infamous as the conflict which introduced chemical weapons to the battleground. Their effects, too horrendous to imagine and too unpredictable to control. In early skirmishes, tear gas was used, but to little real effect. Then, far more lethal substances were introduced. Special German units were formed, and artillery grenades filled with the lethal substances. The soldiers died agonizing deaths. Survivors suffered from terrible chemical burns. The threat of chemical warfare spread far amongst the people of Verdun. They fashioned makeshift masks from wet cloth. But these children wouldn't have survived a serious attack. Gas was also used during the battle for Fort Vaux. The Germans advanced with flamethrowers, step by step. Shortly before the surrender, the fortress's French commander noted, "All communications with the outside world have collapsed. The battle for the fortress is dreadful. The suffering of the wounded is horrendous. We are defeated through exhaustion and thirst." The survivors of Fort Vaux were taken into German captivity. In total, about 8 million soldiers were taken prisoner during the Great War. The Hague Convention of 1907 formed the basis of their treatment. It decreed prisoners should be treated with humanity, and with regards to food, quarters, and clothes, there should be no distinction from one's own troops. But faced with huge numbers of prisoners, the military powers were often unable to cope. During the first winter, there were mass deaths across Europe. There are 2.5 million inmates from 13 different countries in German camps alone. In contrast to captured officers, foot soldiers were put to work, most of them as agricultural laborers. For security reasons, operations essential to the war effort were excluded from the force's labor.
All powers use their prisoners of war that they're allowed to use as labor. Are they significant? Nothing like to the same extent as in the Second World War. It's not in the same deliberate exploitation of this manpower as a resource in the way in which you get in the Second World War. On the other hand, it happens. I mean, this is the beginning of a process.
Some prisoners were released early, especially the wounded and the sick. These are exchanged German soldiers on their way back home. Across Europe, keeping the wartime economy going was now the preserve of women. In Britain alone, 2 million women took up jobs previously held by men. In France, every 5th woman went out to work. it was also women who looked after the destitute and veterans. In Britain, archive footage shows an attempt to entertain those convalescing.
There is often a strong contrast made between the experiences of the soldier at the front and a civilian world which knows nothing of what the war is about, and which lives in a sort of fantasy world, still going to the theatre, still going to restaurants, still relaxing, behaving as though there isn't a war on.
But for soldiers who had recovered from their injuries, life at the front beckoned once more.
Most of those in uniform are citizens in uniform. They're temporary soldiers. They're not career soldiers. These are people who are going to return from the war and take up their previous occupations, whether they were peasants or factory workers or clerks or lawyers. They're going to go back to doing those sorts of things.
Early summer 1916, the British mobilized hundreds of thousands of soldiers for an offensive in support of the French at the Somme, a river basin 250 kilometers to the north of the battles raging around Verdun. The German occupiers had more than a year to dig themselves in and fortify their positions here. The calm before the storm. These reconstructed scenes were to show life in the trenches during lulls in the fighting. By June 1916, there were 20 British and 11 French divisions stationed at the Somme. On the German side, only half that number. In the end, almost 2.5 million soldiers would be fighting here. This was the first battle to be documented extensively on film. British camera teams followed the troops on their way to the front. At the Somme, there was to be a change in battle plans. Before the British infantry launched their attack, artillery was to clear the way with a barrage lasting several days. The British High Command were confident that this tactic would secure the upper hand. British Commander-in-Chief Douglas Haig stated, "The infantrymen simply have to walk over and occupy the German trenches." It was a bold statement based on hard facts. In the following 7 days, 1.5 million shells were to be targeted on just a thin strip of German-held land. June 1916, the Somme. 2.5 million soldiers faced each other. 1,500 Allied artillery pieces targeted their firepower on just a narrow strip of German line. June the 24th, the barrage began. In just 7 days and nights, 1.5 million shells were delivered. The German author Ernst Junger later wrote, "There was artillery fire of unimaginable power that thundered and roared ahead of us. 1,000 flashes enveloped the western horizon like a sea of flames. There was a constant stream of the wounded, returning with bloodless, sunken faces."
Quand on est bombardé, on est totalement impuissant. L'expérience du bombardement, c'est une expérience extrêmement traumatique.
When you're being bombarded, you're completely helpless. The experience is extremely traumatizing. Why? Because you could die at any moment, and you witness the deaths of your comrades all around you. So the bombardments cause trauma in the survivors, who ask themselves, why them? Why not me?
Pourquoi le voisin plutôt que moi?
New, puzzling clinical symptoms began to emerge. Shell shock sufferers. Initially, they were suspected of simulating their condition.
The war physicians decided they were simply particularly shrewd shirkers and treated these people with horrendous forced methods, tied down electroshocks they didn't know.
July the 1st, 1916, the British infantry at the Somme attacked the German lines. They believed the enemy positions had been obliterated by the fierce artillery bombardment. But it was a fallacy. It took just a few machine gunners and cannons to kill 8,000 British soldiers in just half an hour.
They can't retreat either, because the guards in the trenches would shoot them immediately. Soldiers know this. There's no return for them.
These men, with minimal training, faced near certain death, either mown down by German machine gun fire or shot by one of their own. On the German side, their trenches withstood the massive artillery bombardment because their fortifications were several meters deep. But above ground, it was pure devastation. The Battle of the Somme was a gruesome testament to how military commanders clung to outdated tactics. Again and again, General Haig ordered his troops to attack the German positions.
If you lose nearly 20,000 dead and nearly 40,000 wounded in a single day, of course, the experience of the Somme was traumatic. The effects were traumatic in certain battalions, and they were felt throughout those effects throughout British society because those battalions were very often so-called PALS battalions that had been locally recruited, and very often whole platoons, sections had come from the same streets in the same cities.
With over 1 million dead, wounded, and missing on both sides, this was the most costly battle of the First World War.
The Battle of the Somme is really the iconic moment for Britain in terms of its understanding of its own military history in the 20th century. It's the example to avoid. It's what every British general in the Second World War has not to do. And it's also a definition of what can happen if you have a continental outlook on war. This is what European war can be like if you misinterpret it and get it wrong. So it has a very profound long-term effect.
German field hospitals were overflowing with thousands of wounded soldiers. Bielitz, near Berlin. Here, a certain dispatch runner had come to convalesce. Adolf Hitler.
Hitler said the regiment was his home, and he never felt anywhere as much at home as he did in the regiment. Here he had some sort of community and he wanted to get back to it.
What Hitler found was a reflection of the discontent brewing at the front. With the cannon fire still ringing in their ears and the experience of total war fresh in their minds, the convalescing soldiers expressed the horror of what they'd seen in the trenches. Gone was the fervor of war, replaced by a wish for the killing and utter barbarity to stop. For Hitler, it was a shock to be faced by such anti-war sentiment.
And he hated the what he saw, the defeatism and the shirking and the malingering that he saw when he went to Berlin.
In Germany, initial enthusiasm for the war had long since turned into bitter disillusionment. Hitler's love for the military stood out against a backdrop of mistrust and hatred for the military high command. The national mood was becoming more and more strained. There were mass protests and widespread hardship. A resident of Augsburg wrote, "I often don't know whether I'm coming or going. You're supposed to cook. Everyone is hungry, and you have nothing to give them." More and more children became malnourished. Many die. The government was facing heavy criticism. The Kaiser tried to appease with symbolic gestures.
If we stand today in front of the German parliament in Berlin, we see the inscription Dem deutschen Volke, for the German people. And this inscription was made in the end of 1916 to offer the starving German people and suffering German people something. I mean, the German people had no political power, there was no real democracy at this time, they were starving, it was quite a bad situation of the German people, and there was also no hope to gaining political power. So this inscription was so a symbol from the authorities to offer at least a hope to the German people that they might get in the future more political power.
For 2 long years, Germany had been fighting a war on 2 fronts. In the east, the battlefield was more fluid. Russia was forced to relinquish large tracts of land. The war here was still on the move and hadn't ground to a halt in the trenches. The opponents were trying to encircle one another in pincer movements. The Russian army suffered from supply breakdowns, shortages of ammunition and food, which demoralized the soldiers. But in the summer of 1916, a wave of Russian attacks, closely coordinated with the Western Allies, applied pressure on the enemy lines. And there was a change of tactics. The Russian General Brusilov no longer sent his soldiers unprotected into the line of German machine gun fire. He now prepared his attacks carefully, with artillery barrages. The German High Command reacted and withdrew 100,000 soldiers from the Western Front to be transferred to the east.
The Brusilov offensive is absolutely the Eastern Front's contribution to the overall Allied strategy of convergent attacks on all fronts simultaneously to pull the Germans in 3 directions at once. So the Brusilov offensive fulfills its role. And in fact, it's the Brusilov offensive that really provides the relief for the French at Verdun.
Prisoner of war camps on the Eastern Front. Hundreds of thousands were held captive. German POWs were taken to Moscow and St. Petersburg to parade in front of the public. More than 100,000 German soldiers were deported to Siberia. 1 in every 5 men did not return. For the whole of Russia, the war in the East had immense repercussions.
Parts of it are very bloody. It's a slaughter, not the least because the civilian population is more involved.
It wasn't only the Russian soldier who went hungry, but his family and entire cities. Resentment grew, while the nobility and the Tsar's family lived lives of luxury. The war deepened the chasm between the ruler and his people. It was fertile breeding ground for rampant political discontent. Within a year, the Russian Revolution would topple the Tsar's regime. Kaiser Wilhelm II, he too was living on borrowed time. The war would also wipe him and his family from power. But that was to come later. The Great War was entering its decisive, bloody stage. Germany, in a final desperate attempt to break through the Western Front, would throw everything they had into one last monstrous assault. And on the horizon, a new fighting force with weapons to match: the Americans.